So I'm going to share today a perspective on deepfakes and synthetic media, global threats and solutions for journalists. As Asbeta noted, my name's Sam Gregory. I am the program director at the human rights group Witness. My contact information is here if you wish to follow up. For those who are not familiar with our work, just a piece of context for it. We work globally. The Witness team is distributed across the globe, and we work at both a grassroots level, supporting people who use video and technology to protect and defend human rights and participate in civic journalism, and also work at a systemic level, looking at the challenges that both help people to do this and impede them. And so it's in that context that I want to talk about deepfakes. And I will share, I think, 4 perspectives within this talk. First, I want to make sure that I ground people very clearly in what are deepfakes and synthetic media technologies, not assuming that people are completely familiar with the range. Then I want to talk about deepfakes in context and some insight into the threat models we've heard globally to journalists, civic activists, and others. Then I'll talk about relevant solutions for journalists, and then some questions around 2 of the key approaches that are often highlighted in considering responses to this form of media manipulation. So what's known as detection and what are known as sort of authenticity approaches. To kick off in terms of the question of deepfakes, what are they? I'm not going to get very technical in this, and I know you've had some earlier papers that are looking at the question of the deepfakes in newsrooms, some of the early deployments of AI news presenters, as well as AI in the workflow of newsrooms. You know, at the very simplest way of thinking about deepfakes, just very basically, we should assume that particularly for the types of deepfakes I'm talking about, which are primarily audio and visual deepfakes, we're providing the deepfake training data when we share large amounts of images online, for example, of our faces. The advances in AI and machine learning that are being used to then generate more and more realistic representations of real people, their voices, their faces, or real events, are then entered into an algorithm that is a type of cat and mouse game between an algorithm that is generating representations of reality or realistic representations of reality, and another that is trying to detect them. And they are competing to generate better and better representations of supposedly real objects, like my face, or like a face of a human that had never existed, or a scene that looks realistic. And there are, of course, many ways to do this, and I'm not going to go into the depth on, you know, the pros and cons of different generative methods, but let's assume that there are lots of ways. And this, of course, is one of the most productive areas of research at the moment. A lot of research happening around how do we think about these so-called generative models. So what can we do with these technologies of deepfakes? What are they capable of? And what I want to emphasize in this context is I think a lot of the time when we start to think about threats and solutions in the journalistic world is we overemphasize one aspect of deepfakes, which is the sort of face swap deepfakes, the sort of perfect face swap that we've often seen in the popular media, right? It used to be Nicolas Cage. You could find Nicolas Cage swapped into everyone. Most recently, it was Tom Cruise, right? In some fake videos on TikTok that showed his face. But I think it's important to think about this as covering a range of spaces that impact a range of journalistic practices. So one area that has become already very easily commercialized and available in your Adobe tools is, of course, object edits. What I mean by that is the ability to remove an object in a video. Here, you know, this demonstration video showing the removal of the cars. And the importance of these techniques is, of course, they make it easier to tidy up your videos. They also make it easier to, for example, confuse OSINT-based investigations. For example, when a journalist looks at open source material and tries to work out whether it is correct or reliable. The ability to do simple things like change the background in an image. This is an example of actually an algorithm that is 2 or 3 years, maybe even 4 years old at this point, that is changing the weather in an image, in this case a video, to add snow to an image or remove snow. And of course, the place where we're starting to see, in fact, the most use of this in mis and disinformation already is this ability to create these faces or objects that never existed. So I'm sure most people are familiar with this concept, this idea that you can generate a face of someone who never existed. And the progress on this actually reflects generally the progress in what we think of as synthesis, so generation of fake images. And in fact, this graph I have here shows it only up to 2018. Really this sort of improvement in generating the face of someone who looks like a human but never existed, right? So these are not real people. These are representations of what a human looks like as generated by a computer. And we are starting to see these used in mis and disinformation campaigns, often to represent fake profiles. There was a very high profile case last year in the US, not a very complex case, but a fake profile photo used to represent a journalistic source for a story about Hunter Biden, the son of the then presidential candidate, President Biden. And so it's basically a fake story with a fake photo to avoid things like reverse image search to trace down if someone is real or not. We're seeing a lot of app-based manipulation happening, and I think this is a space where it's really important to note, and like I'm sharing the sort of funny example here of me, with my aged or changed in perceived gender identity. But this is the space where we're seeing a radical expansion of access to these tools that I think is important to track and understand how that impacts journalistic practice, potential deception. Other areas that are evolving quite fast at the moment, real-time expression mapping. This is the ability to transfer the expressions from someone to a fake face. There was a certain amount of panic a couple of weeks ago in the European media around a supposed deepfake of the chief of staff of Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident, in which people thought they were being fooled on a Zoom call by someone whose face looked like the chief of staff. And I think what people were worrying about was this type of thing, where you can take a face and transfer the motions of lips to that person and make it look like they're speaking. In that case, it was not. It was an impersonator, but there is rapid progress in this ability to do what we might describe as sort of puppeteering, right? Control someone's face, someone else's face, to make it look like they're saying or doing something here. And again, this is quite settled technology. This is not like state of the art. This is research from 3 or 4 years ago that is starting to be deployed at this point in real world usages. One place that people may have seen this type of puppetry in very sort of contemporary ways is in the last couple of months, a lot of people played with a tool called Deep Nostalgia, which was where you could reanimate your grandparent or your ancestor's photo and make it look like they were smiling. And we've seen tools to do this. I'm not sure whether my audio will play, but I'll just play the first 2 seconds of this one. Oh, what just happened there? I didn't mean to do that, excuse me. And so this is just very simple technologies that are starting to be commercialized and made available. And similarly, the ability to transfer motion. So I've been describing transferring face expressions, creating realistic objects that never existed. And we can also look at the phenomenon of essentially transferring the motion from one person to a representation of another person. So this is an example of making someone appear to dance. So we're transferring the motion from the person on the right-hand side to the person on the representation of a person on the main screen. That's not a real person. That is like a computer-generated model of a person with the movements transferred from another source, right? So this is kind of fun. We all want to dance like a pro, but you can also see how this can be made to look like someone is drunk or incapacitated or any number of things like that. And the way these start to come together in malicious forms are what we know as things like lip sync dubbing. So this is an example. I'm not going to play the video, which people have probably seen, of Mark Zuckerberg being made to say things he never said, right? You transfer the lip movements, you maybe use an impersonator, you make it look like someone said or did something they never said. And then finally, the face swaps, which I mentioned, the Tom Cruise one, which people have probably seen. And this is, of course, what is most visible, but I want to emphasize there's a lot of subtle ways we can think about manipulation as we start to think about threats entering the journalistic space. Let me summarize those briefly for folks, and then I'm going to move into threats and solutions. So alter video, just like with photos, create a realistic voice or face for a human who never existed, and manipulate the voice or audio of someone, video or audio, to make someone's lips, voice, face, or body appear to do something they never did. Now, often when I talk about this issue, people say, well, seriously, my problem is not with deepfakes, it's with every other fake news phenomenon that is out there already, right? So they're kind of like, I have 1,000 problems and deepfakes aren't one of them. And I think it's important in this context to ask, should we be worried, right, about this in the current context? And the motto we've had at Witness is don't panic, but do prepare. And I think that's a really important thing to think about in this environment is, you know, what are we doing to prepare? And there are reasons to take this seriously, right? The quality of these fakes is improving. The research direction is very directly towards making this more accessible. The quality of multimodal integration, so combining video and audio, is improving. The ability to do this in real time is improving. And it's becoming more accessible. So I mentioned the issue of kind of appification becoming more available in apps. All of those questions mean that we have a radically expanded, you know, attack surface if we're worried about people using these maliciously. And of course, we need to put this in the context of bigger cognitive issues, like our reception of video is very different from our reception of photos and text, right? So when we see fake video, it has a pretty direct impact in terms of things like false memory. And we have to, of course, place this in broader societal trends around weaponization of distrust in visual media and what is known as the liar's dividend, which is this ability of people to say that everything is fake. So you can claim that real video is fake. So how should we prioritize threats? I would say that we tend to overhype the threats here around sort of big political mis and disinformation. So these types of headlines around, you know, they're going to swing the, you know, in this case, the US 2020 election, feel off target. Instead, you know, we probably need to look much more, and I just apologize, my slide deck is playing up a little bit, at a more diverse set of threat scenarios. And the way we've been doing this in the Witness context is really trying to bring the discussion about threats and solutions to a much more diverse set of audiences. And so in collaboration, for example, with the BBC, we hosted a meeting with major media to identify threats and solutions. And we've done similar things with media globally. So in Brazil, in sub-Saharan Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. And I'm sharing at the bottom the link to our kind of area where you can see the collated responses to all of this at that web link. And these are the reports that came out of that. And the top line thing that I think is really important to emphasize is that the vast majority of threats from deepfakes now come from non-consensual sexual media. So people generating fakes of women that place them in sexual contexts without their consent. And so when we think about threats in the journalistic space, the first place we should start is threats towards journalists from that, right? So not mis and disinformation threats, but threats from manipulated media. And there was a recent survey from UNESCO that looked at this and online violence against women. And in that survey, they found that, you know, up to 20% of women journalists had faced non-consensual sexual images. and a growing number were facing deepfakes and related shallow fakes, so non-consensual sexual images created with simpler forms of manipulation than artificial intelligence. So as we center threats around deepfakes for journalists, I think first we need to say, look, primarily at the moment, this is about targeting journalists themselves. And when we talked to across this range of journalists and civic leaders about what they worried about in terms of threats, key areas they raised were these. So first, this one I'm talking about here about targeting journalists themselves with this material. And then the second broad category is really how this is used as a way to undermine genuine media and how this responds to the gaps that journalists have. So already, and I think this is particularly true globally, of course, most governments don't want compromising material. Most people in power don't want it. And you've also had a corresponding increase in citizen media, in citizen video that demonstrates abuses of power. For example, right now, critical videos coming out of a country like Myanmar or Colombia, or that we're maybe seeing from Israel and Palestine right now. And the deepfakes create a climate in which it's possible to dismiss any true video as fake and to put the pressure on journalists and fact checkers to prove real. And that is incredibly challenging to do. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of detection and authentication in the current environment. So, journalists see this whole range of threats and concerns that they have in this space around reputation attacks, around people trying to deceive them. And so when we get very specific around journalistic challenges, I've mentioned a few more here. In sessions with journalists, we very much people pointing to kind of weaknesses in journalistic workflows as well. For example, single camera broadcast. I was mentioning the Zoom context. So single camera broadcast is a vulnerable space for hacking, and Reuters has done work in that. And generally this perception that there'll be pressure on news organizations to prove something is true as well as to prove false, which is a very challenging epistemological dynamic, but also very practical media forensics and capacity gap. In terms of solutions, I'm going to talk maybe for just 4 or 5 minutes about solutions and then go into hopefully some questions. Broadly, people in the consultations we've done highlight a range of solutions that they want. And when it points to journalists, I think the key ones here are access to tools and support around tools. And I'm going to talk about why that's an issue now in terms of when it comes to detection tools, what the challenges are and the dynamics around those. So when we look at the tools available to journalists, broadly speaking, we could be looking at, can we teach people to spot these? Can we look at detection tools, and can we look for tools for authentication? So I'm actually not going to talk in depth about the idea that we can teach people to spot deepfakes. I think there's a lot of myths around spotting deepfakes that deceive people, right? Like this idea that you can spot that they have shimmering eyes or that the hairline doesn't look right. The problem is research already shows that people don't have a good ability to discern deepfakes when we actually start testing it out. People are not good at spotting the quality or the manipulation. And also people get deceived by sort of easy tips that age quickly. So for example, people used to think that deepfakes didn't blink. And I remember talking to the researcher who worked on that, and he said, look, I published a paper about this, and within, I think it was a month, someone sent me a deepfake that blinked, because what people had done is, of course, they'd updated their algorithms to make deepfakes that blink, right? Because this is a generative adversarial process that we're grappling here with. So we can't use what we might think of as the current algorithmic Achilles heel of these algorithms as the detection tip that we as journalists or as citizens use. So, when it comes to what journalists can do, we've generally been recommending a kind of 3-step process, right? You can look for these types of giveaways, these kind of like synthetic glitches, like the distortion on a hairline, but it's not all that useful in the long run. You can then apply existing sort of video verification approaches, which is very much where we would come from, like, image reverse search to see if this has been adapted from another location or another time. And then you can start to use kind of emerging types of tools like that are coming out of research labs at the moment. The problem with those is most of them aren't very accurate right now. So I can't really recommend a lot of AI-based tools for doing verification. And the reason for that is they're still trying to bridge the gap between what journalists need and what is possible with the tools, right? So journalists often deal with a lot of quantity, videos that are, say, compressed, right? You encountered them in a Facebook feed or a WhatsApp group. And many of the detection tools are not reliable for that type of detection yet. So as an example, one of the largest detection challenges to develop tools, called the Deepfake Detection Challenge, the best algorithm on that was really only successful about 65% of the time. And that is not a very good hit rate if you're trying to disprove things. And it probably wouldn't work so well on a new falsification technique. And I think we have to be very careful about trying to sort of plug these into some of these publicly available algorithms. So I want to tell a short story about that, which is that a few months ago, there was a scare in Myanmar around a video that was shared online that appeared to show the confession of a senior politician to corruption. And he'd been arrested by the military, and it's a very awkward video. He looks like he's under duress. He doesn't sound like himself. And people in Myanmar obviously worried that it might be a deep fake, right? That he'd been manipulated to say this. And they put it in a public detector. So you can go online and find these detectors publicly. And the problem with the public detector is it said with 95% probability it is a deep fake. And the problem is that it probably isn't. And it's because these public detectors are designed for one type of deep fake and a video that is high quality. And this is a low quality deep fake that is generated with an unknown technique if it was a deep fake. And the problem here is, of course, then people panic that there's a deep fake behind every door. And that is one of the biggest problems we're hearing, is that people fear now that there are deep fakes everywhere. And that is then weaponized by people in power to say, we have to prove true around things. You can't believe what you see. Let me end with one just note around the other area that is developing rapidly in this space, which is tools for kind of tracking how media has been manipulated over time. There are a number of initiatives starting to emerge in this area. The two I would note for folks are the Content Authenticity Initiative and the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. These are initiatives involving major stakeholders like Adobe and Microsoft and the BBC. Witness has been involved as a member of building those initiatives, but also a critical viewpoint on them. And what those are trying to do is track better how do we find out and think about the provenance and authenticity and attribution of media. So instead of trying to detect falsification, how do we track where media comes from and how it's been changed over time? And I think the important thing for people in the journalistic world to think about this is this could really benefit us, right? In terms of tracking and understanding media, making sure that, media production is not misattributed or changed. At the same time, it comes into a landscape where we have to worry about, can this be used globally? Who may be worried very legitimately about sharing media that has all these signals, right? If you're worried about privacy or anonymity or source protection. And so we've published a report recently, I'll just basically leave this as a reference, that looks into the dilemmas around how to think about authenticity and provenance, right? These questions that come up around privacy and anonymity, whose voices are compromised or excluded in this, who might get excluded in the global media landscape. So we thank you for your time, and I apologize I overran by a minute or two for what I'd expected to say. I encourage you to take a look at this link, and there's much more resources there, both for journalists, but also in background research. Thank you.